Hi, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the review of 2015 from a ShelterBox perspective. So, what have we been doing this year? Well, there you go. If you look at the map, we've kind of got that geographic spread where the sun hasn't set on ShelterBox at some times during the year. We've done the very small, from the Vanuatu's right the way up to the larger, more worldwide sort of spotlight deployments, such as Syria and the wider African Boko Haram violence. So there, the map, and we've also got off to quite a busy start this year, but that will be covered in another podcast I'm going to do in the next couple of days about what we're up to at the moment. About 12 months ago, in fact just over that, we had the Gaza conflict, which was Israel was in a conflict with people in the Gaza Strip, the Palestinian paramilitaries. We as ShelterBox aren't here to get involved in the whys and wherefores. We just know that people are without shelter, and that's where we need to be. And the boxes, because the destruction, we're going to see some photographs later on, will show you why a box was the best option. We had about 500 boxes. Now, this, because of conflict, we have the high security elements of it, and the Palestinian element meant that it was behind a border that could open and shut at a moment's notice. We did not want to get our people trapped behind a border that we couldn't support them, and the security situation could spin out of control. So we elected to do this fully remotely, which is not something we would prefer to do, but it's something when we're forced to do it, as we've covered before. So we had 500 shelter boxes out with families, and there you can see why ShelterBox is the best option. You can see that in the photograph. Everything's just completely trashed, shelling and bombing, and there's our little ShelterBox tent right in the middle of it, providing shelter for that while people sort themselves out, and hopefully ACTED, who was our partner in this, will be able to help them with the rebuild materials and training that they need to move on from that tent. And then we have a more traditional setting where some of the camps that were set up in Gaza are outside of the urbanisation that was under fire. Right, moving on to my first memory of the year, deployment. Well, not that I was asleep for the Gaza thing, but that was going on through the December in the remote sort of setup. I was actually on call over the Christmas and New Year period last year. In fact, that's 2014, 2015. And we got a phone call and some emails from Malaysia. James Ong is our representative out there. He's a fundraiser. He was saying that Malaysia had unseasonal floods, and they were getting overwhelmed, and the Prime Minister was desperate for help, and because they weren't geared up for floods normally, it's not something they normally get in any huge sort of dimensions, they were a little bit caught out. So we sent the team with basically a phone number and a deployment instruction, and the next day they were in the Prime Minister's office. I use this picture particularly because most people lose a house during the disasters that we respond to, but this poor family actually gained a house. The neighbour's house with the floodwater lifted off its foundations, drifted across, so you can see how high the water was in that occasion, and then plonked itself on the house, and as the water receded, that's where it remained. So that family, as you can see there, got their ShelterBox tent, while themselves and the neighbours dismantled the house that was on top of their house, and then rebuild the house that was weakened and damaged by having the weight on top of the roof like that, which probably isn't geared up for it. In Malaysia, it's worst flooding in 55 years, hence they're being caught on the hop. And just under 1,000 families with shelter boxes and midi tents. Midi tents are very good for a flood, and very good for short term because they're smaller, they're not built to the rigorous standards. They are about 3/4 as waterproof. They are 100% waterproof, but that level of waterproofing, as the material degrades, becomes less and less until eventually it seeps through. So not being as waterproof doesn't mean it lets in water, it just means it won't last as long. And they're designed for small families. As you can see there, not a large amount of space to put the tent, and also because they're cheaper. We don't want to waste owners' money giving people a tent when they don't need the tent for afterwards. And the midi is single skinned and a lot cheaper. So nearly 1,000 families helped in Malaysia. Moving on to Malawi, this is one of the ones I actually got involved in. I went out as the in-country coord, which is the person that coordinates all of the efforts and try and link up all the parts of the cluster, the logistics, where the teams are, coordinating the efforts between the teams and trying to get everything pointing in the right direction. It's the worst flooding in memory. It came in unseasonably, so it had winds behind it as well, which attacked the mud brick houses from the side, melted the walls, the walls collapsed, and literally the house just dissolves. Very, very poor country, very beset with problems of corruption, so a lot of aid agencies choose not to work there because of the corruption elements of it. It's very difficult to operate. The currencies are very small notes. I think the biggest note you can have is a £2 note because it makes it not worth the while doing counterfeit copies. And we also, for the first time, and something we want to try again this year and continue into the future, is have someone at the cluster coordination role. Now, the cluster coordination is all people who have an interest in a certain sector, be it medical, security, food, what have you. Our particular interest, of course, is shelter. And all the groups that are working in that area gather a couple of times a week or sometimes once a day to coordinate the efforts, share information and make it all a bit more joined up and professional and help the beneficiaries with the minimum amount of effort to increase the efficiency. Now, that is run by the UN and it is also run by the IFRC, depending on what sort of response it is. And we put someone on the course to be part of that cluster, and then they were invited to go to Malawi to be part of that, which helped enormously to coordinate the efforts of all involved, and we can get a view from the other side as well. We'd like to do it again in the future. One that gives us a global role. We can input into the decisions that we're helping with the government. Their role is to assist the government, not to take over, not to rule it. You know, we're all outsiders going into those countries, but to assist the government in something it might not be used to dealing with. Malawi, we worked out that one box was 14 years worth of salary in every box. So you can see a reason why they're happy, because you can't buy tents like that in Malawi. And if you can, you know, it's one of the poorest countries in the world. So, you know, their funds won't stretch. And because of the damaged harvest cycle this year, there's enormous food poverty as well. So people are spending their money on food, and they were at the time because the crops were destroyed. So they haven't got the money to rebuild. So these tents and the shelter kits have all gone to, you know, help them survive while the entire economy of the nation picks up again and the harvests and the seasons kick in. We sent a monitoring and evaluation team back into Malawi, and it's kind of drawn together a lot of the things that we've been learning over the last few years. About what do we actually do and how do we do it. For instance, you know, it's not a product-based approach. You know, you give them a tent, that's not it. What have you actually done? I mean, the donors are putting their money into ShelterBox. They want something to show for it, not just you delay the problem. If someone hasn't got a home or a shelter, somewhere to live, and you give them a tent, in a year when that tent wears out, you know, with the wind and the ultraviolet, you know, gradually grinds that tent down, and it starts to fall apart. The big question is, what happens then? Have they moved on? Are they actually helped by what ShelterBox has done? And this is the Malawi element to it, is what we've learned over the years is kind of showcased in Malawi, that by just spending a little bit more time there and trying to figure out how we can do slightly different things. Is it buying lumber? Is it integrating with other agencies that are giving out food so they can then use the money to buy rebuild materials? That is actually doing something a little bit, you know, more than just relying on good luck and good fortune. We can actually get involved in that because we don't want to keep going back, and we don't want to just delay a problem. We want to actually play some part in the recovery, and we do a lot of the time. But in the poorer, more challenging areas, we think we need to be around a little bit longer after the deployment phase to see if we can help in some way to carry that journey back to being housed rather than just being an isolated stepping stone. In this picture here is one of my favourites of the year actually is people absolutely ecstatic and elated to receive that aid. I've shown video before on some of my webinars of the reception that the aid got in Malawi. I won't bore you again by showing it, but look back in the past, absolutely tear-jerking stuff of how grateful they are to receive the aid, and our job is to make sure, one, that aid gets there, that it's ethically distributed, but also to see how it ties in with being part of an ongoing process. Now moving on to Madagascar, again very poor, not very well equipped, but unfortunately in the way of typhoons as they roll through the Indian Ocean. We have aid stored with the BNGRC, which is basically a military element of their disaster relief, and they were hit by a tropical storm, Chedza, and they started distributing the aid. A little bit naughty of them, but that's what you're going to get. They're not going to stand around and see people out of shelter with our aid being stored there. They were quick off the mark. So we tried to match that by sending a team quick off the mark as well to go out there and ensure what they'd done was right, and also conduct some training after the fact to make sure that they could look after those tents. And there you have it, using every space available to make sure that they have that temporary home while they rebuild. That's just a quick snapshot of how much the floodwaters had come up. That was just a day apart, taken in that photograph from pretty much the same spot. You can see that bridge going across there, and you can see how much the water had come up. That floodplain, as you can see, is all farmland, completely dry, but in the left-hand photograph you can see how much the floodwater had come up, completely devastated, because it's always the marginalised and the least able to fend for themselves who are pushed onto those floodplains to build and live, and of course they're the persons that get hit when that floodplain actually lives up to its name and becomes a floodplain. Again, Vanuatu, another cyclone, another marginalised community. Vanuatu, very poor. Tourism is about its only industry. It's one of the Pacific Islands. Cyclone Pam ripped through there. There's a lot of interesting challenges to Vanuatu. One, it's in the middle of nowhere, and then when you get to the middle of nowhere, you have to get a plane and a boat from that middle of nowhere to go even further into the middle of nowhere. So logistics is a challenge. Also, very limited resources. You can't turn up with loads and loads of aid workers when there's not a lot of food, there's not a lot of infrastructure, there's not a lot of support mechanisms. So actually having people in the more remote areas actually puts an enormous strain on the local resources. So there are a lot of aid agencies who have a vested interest in there, and they're working hard to set up longer aid programs. And if you do not play ball with them, you can't just turn up and do your own thing. It's their sort of area that they have the connections, they have the partnerships and the relationships that are built up. So you have to fit in with their plans. If you turn up with a load of tents, that's not going to fit in with their aid agency sort of work. And this is where the cluster comes in, is where you have to do from, I remember a phrase that's haunted me from Malawi, is the UN representatives, is not what you can do, it is the solution that can be accommodated. And that's a terrible phrase, but it's true. It's what can be worked with the possibilities and the permissions and the way things are going on. You can't just swan in there with what you think is a great idea. You have to do with what is working. And looking at that, we turned up with tarps, toolkits, and blankets. That was what was being, that was what would integrate to the other aid package that was going on. And you can see in the picture there, those are the tarps that are going over the top of their, the houses that they're building out of the local materials available. So that's a lot of tarps. I mean, I'd much rather give more aid package and and do boxes and tents and what have you, but it just doesn't fit in with what is going on. Looking at that building there, that's breeze blocks, but you can see the impact that typhoon had. It just smashed that house, that building to bits with the power of the typhoon. That's Rachel in the photograph there. She's doing monitoring and evaluation to make sure that our aid is the right stuff, that it was done in the right way, and what we can learn about the way we do things to make it more effective in the future, contents and method. And that, in the background, is the kind of thing that the shelter kits go towards to build. Using natural materials, recycled materials from the damaged houses, they've built themselves a little dwelling there, and and then that can be part of the core of a larger shelter as they build up resources. We sent a team earlier in the year, and this would be sort of springtime, to the DPR, which is North Korea, to other people. A typhoon had hit North Korea. Now, you're looking at the inside of a Flex 3 tent. That green background is the inner. There's an inner and an outer, and you can see the left-hand side there is a stove there. And that stove is going through the wall of the tent. You can see there's a reinforced area that builds resistance to the heat, but also that chimney is dual core. It's sucking cold air from outside into the box to burn it, and then the smoke goes out of the middle. And that keeps that pipe a little bit cooler than it would be if it was just the exhaust. And that is what it looks like from the outside. And we had 400 families with those Flex 3s. Now that's commercially available from an aid agency, an aid supplier. And it is a harder wearing tent. It is slightly larger, more upright, more headroom, and goes with that stove. So why on earth aren't we adopting that? Well, with the package that provides for the harsh winters, that costs about twice as much, if not more, than the standard package. So if we supplied everyone with a tent like that, we'd only do half the number of families. So that is not a one-off, but it's a particular situation that the aid is tailored towards what the beneficiary needs. And hopefully that is the path that we're on, and we're going to keep going down that path, is finding out what the beneficiary needs and responding to that. So the North Korea stuff, because of their harsh winters, and they use the tent for a long time because their rebuild tends to be a little bit slow because of the lack of resources, and also they recycle and reuse it. We go for the tent that can cope with that environment. Now, halfway through the year, Nepal hit by a gigantic earthquake. And we responded. We had, I think, over 20 SRTs at one point. And we had lots and lots of boxes on charters ready to go. The Nepalese government and the cluster were not into the tents and the boxes. They decided in their wisdom that tents and boxes weren't a great idea, and it was going to be shelter kits and repair. Now, we're trying to get around that, so we found all of the people who've been discharged from hospital with nowhere to go. We found that the government would accept the boxes and the tents for that. We had some aid left over. There's 69 boxes there on the distribution list, and they were left over from the last time. And as the charters are literally waiting to go, they were refused landing permits because the aid that was inside them, boxes and tents, were not allowed to be landed because the government had decided what was good aid and what was bad aid to come in, and the tents and boxes, they weren't on the good list. So we had a little think, and we regrouped, and we found a way around it, and that was to go with the Nepalese government restrictions, and that was to buy locally sourced shelter kits that had elements of the Wrigley tin as well, as you can see in the background there, but our shelter kits as well were allowed to be in, and locally bought shelter kits as well. So we're also lots and lots of tarps, just tarps. Now I'd again want to provide more, but with the restrictions, that's all we could do. So at the end of the year, we've got quite a high total, but we'll come back to that and explain the whys and wherefores behind that. But a significant amount of that is the tarps from Nepal, which we were forced to go down because that was the restrictions. But as much as the green box is ShelterBox's unique selling product, the way we do things, I'm hoping, will become as unique as the box, in that we will find a way. If there is restrictions and a political situation is a problem, then our smart volunteers and staff will find a way, and we will discuss it in the ops room and see if we can get around it on that particular day. Over 13,500 families supported with tarps, UN tents, because we had to fit in with everyone else's, and 69 boxes and over 1,700 shelter kits. And that's pretty much a good selection. We got the tent and the shelter kits in that photograph from Nepal there, and we're just about to send a monitoring and evaluation team back in there to see how the ongoing shelter kit distributions are going. Chile, again, shelter kits. We had a big earthquake and we had flooding in the north. You can see that earthquake in the south was chucking out an enormous amount of ash, and that's what it does. The ash settles on the roof, and because it's basically stone, it crushes the roof. They're not built for that, so it just destroys the buildings by the build-up. It doesn't take much to wreck those houses. So we had 1,500 shelter kits to help with the flooding, but mainly due to the ash destruction there. Now, moving into the summer, we have the Greek, I'm not going to say Greek tragedy, that's far too much of a cliche. The ongoing Syrian issues. Now, we've been at ShelterBox distributing in Syria for ever since the beginning, over 3 years ago now, and we've put millions of pounds worth of aid to try and keep those communities together within Syria, but forces outside ShelterBox are far stronger than we are, and some of those people are moving on. Now, to bear in mind, those are the people with money to pay for that trip. These are the people who are able to move, physically able to move. These are the people who have the will, who aren't too frightened, who have the options. So we are trying to help the most vulnerable by the majority. I mean, we're talking 98% of our aid that we're talking about going into this has gone to try and get as close to the source as we can to keep those communities together. Now, there's a lot of things swirling around the Greece thing that we had to take into account before we decided to deploy or not. Now, one of the sort of like guidelines that we use is, shouldn't someone else be doing this? Hasn't someone else got more money? Isn't someone else closer to the issue? Isn't somebody else's job to respond to the displacement issue that we're talking about? And Greece, being in the EU and the Schengen policy, should have a means to sort them out. Once they declare that they're refugees in the European Union, it's dealt with by European funds, and people are giving a home, if they're legitimate, within the EU. That's how it's supposed to work. Now, we all know, and I'm not going to start pointing the finger, that due to the numbers and other political issues, that didn't quite work out. So we had, at one point, lots of people giving us information that, it was taking days and days to put people into that system. So people were outside of the UN system, within Europe as a geographical position, but outside of Europe politically. So they weren't being dealt with quickly. They were spending days in the baking sun in the middle of summer in the Mediterranean. That they were walking to bigger collection centres or processing centres over the mountains without protection. People were collapsing. And we knew that the winter was coming, so if they didn't sort themselves out, then +2 and raining, if you're out in the open, you're not going to last too long, and that particularly if you come from Syria and you've been on a long journey. So we sent a team to see whether we can actually work on the fringes, on the peripheries. The UN were on the outside, not wanting or being able to wade in there because of the European element of it. The government not being geared up to do it, and we had to look at the criteria we were in there. Now, we thought we could do 100 tents, UN, because they fitted in with everybody else. We knew there were risks. People moving through every 2 or 3 days, there's no sense of ownership. Camp management was chaotic at best because the situation was completely overwhelmed. Now, we don't do camp management, so that's not something we can get into. It's something we can think about in the future, but it's not geared up to our model. So we deployed 100 tents, and they were used for just over a month while the UN sorted themselves out. Land is at an enormous premium, so eventually when the tents were used up quite rapidly because of that lack of ownership, maintenance issues, and the land was needed as well for IKEA, for instance, came in with some hardened shelters, and the land was more used. So we had a very intense usage of the tents, which left them completely beyond use. We sent another team to sort and dispose of those tents, but the amount of families, you imagine 100 tents, a family going through every 2 or 3 days. That's an enormous amount of families that were helped, and they were certainly on the ragged edge after the journey that they'd come. So Greece, it's on the outside of what we should be doing, and it's in the ideal world there wouldn't be any space for us to operate, but the world isn't ideal and the resources are limited, so we did have that window opening, and that's the difference between why we are in Greece and we're not in Calais, because Calais, they are, that is a French issue and it's a European issue, and they are in Europe at that point. So that's why we are not doing the Calais thing, but we are doing the Greece thing. Again, grey areas, difficult to argue, difficult to come out with a clear pros and cons, but we sat down and we came down in favour of sending a team. Incidentally, we're sending another team, in fact they're travelling today to Leros, another Greek island, to see if we can reproduce that model and take the learning points that we've got from that. And we'll keep you posted in the next couple of days with the next update. But there you go, there's a photograph of what we're trying to do. Some children there who are happy. They've got somewhere to call their own, if only for a few days while they're processed. Tanzania, political and violence and unrest driving people across the border into Tanzania from Burundi. Nearly 1,000 families supported with UN spec tents. It's not gone as quickly as I'd like, because we are again fitting in with the UN and going at their pace, because you can't just go rogue, because that would introduce jealousy issues and it would create a lightning rod for a lot of issues. But we've got 1,000 tents in Tanzania that are being used by Burundians who have come across, hoping for that violence to calm down when the elections happen and it all calms down, they can go back. A lot of work went into that, very high security, but we've had teams before, during and after to see what's going on there. Syria, again, an unusual year, an unusual situation, but our pipelines with various agencies has been going, and we've helped over 3,000 families with UN tents, non-food items, and we've got 6 partners going down in Syria. And hopefully, we're definitely going to be here this year in 2016, and hopefully 2017 we won't be in Syria, but who knows. But these are desperate times, desperate families, and we're trying to keep those communities together in Syria so they don't start spilling out into and having to make journeys across oceans and trying to get into Europe, trying to keep those communities together. And then we have the UN tents to fit in with everyone else because of the high security situation. Right. Iraqi Kurdistan. Again, Syria spilling out into there. Because there's all sorts of tents and the security situation isn't as high as Syria, we go with our preferred option, which is our standard ShelterBox tent with non-food items. And we've got 327 families in tents that have been displaced internally by ISIS and the borders that keep changing within that conflict from there. Interesting enough, if you look at that photograph, they wall off the end of the porch and use that as their cooking area, that communal cooking area, which is interesting because our other tent that we've been looking at, the OAS tent, has that extended mouth on the porch, which is kind of what was very popular in this part of the world, is to actually make a cooking kitchen area and seal off the end of the porch in that way. Niger, Boko Haram violence driving families out of Nigeria, suicide bombs, whole villages being massacred, all sorts of horrendousness is driving people across the border into the bottom right hand corner of Niger. Originally started responding to the flooding, and we've moved on to further sort people out down in the bottom right hand corner of Niger, and that's going to be ongoing in 2016 as well. As a never ending sort of flow of migrants coming out of Nigeria with the violence. But in 2015 we did 1,216 families. Now if you look at that photograph, that tent is I can't remember the actual age of it, but it was something horrendous. It had been there like a year. Now, if you look at the porch has been eaten away by the sun and the movement, but the rest of that tent is actually pretty well looked after. It's in reasonable nick. And why the porch has gone, because the porch, because it's only one bit of material at the front, moves around a lot more than the rest of the tent. All of that tent is in under the same UV pressure from the sun, but it's the tent movement on the front of the porch which has caused that damage. So I'm showing that picture to show you exactly the kind of conditions that tent is up against: sandblasting and the UV and the time. But we've got an ongoing program in Niger with Plan to figure out where we go from there, and we'll be finding out in the next year where we're going to go and how that engages with those families to make that part of their recovery. Well, that's a nice sight. I mean, what I always liked to see, what is always really nice, is when you can see that extra work that's gone into not just the tent going up, but they've built a drainage area where they can walk. It shows that extra effort has gone in, that it is their home, that they are actually engaging with their own recovery by building extra bits and bobs around the tent to make their lives better. Cameroon, moving on to Cameroon now, 1,224 families with shelter boxes, and they've got violence in the north of Cameroon, which is driving people out. Hopefully that'll all calm down and then they can move back. But at the moment, we've got plans to continue our work with AIDA in Cameroon. Violence is too extreme in the north for us to get a team there for any length of time. We might be looking at a quick dash to see how it is. AIDA have been a great success story of the year. It's a charity that works in Africa. They have the local contacts, the cultural understanding, the local connections, their ability to move in a much less risk, but they don't have the support of the donors that ShelterBox enjoys. So we've done a hookup. We use their contacts, they use our training on the tents and our knowledge, and it works pretty well. I'd like to put a team out, as I always do, but I don't want to put the team at too much risk. But we'll look at the stats of remote and what have you later on. But a great success story, and we'll be continuing that as the violence continues and the need goes on this year in 2016. And does that make your heart proud, looking at all those tents there in the middle of nowhere where they would have, I mean, you look at how much cover those people would have if they're just building. There's not enough material to make shelter there, but with those tents, they can bide their time, get on with their lives, and then move back when the violence is gone. More flooding in Korea, and the team are due out tomorrow, and we'll find out what went on. We've sent 400 Flex 3s, our standard North Korean package, and we'll find out how well that got on in the next few days. Hopefully I'll be able to report back in a few days. Now, looking at 2015 as a whole, 28,085 households. If you are mega pessimistic, now when I say mega pessimistic, is that in Nepal, we were talking about the tarps, I've gone for, or the ops team has gone for, if it's 2 tarps have gone out, that's 1 family. So that's ultra pessimistically, but sometimes 1 tarp goes to 1 family, whatever's appropriate. So if someone says 29,000 households, then that's probably more closer to the mark realistically. But I always go with the more pessimistic figures, which is just over 28,000 households helped. And if you look at that, there's a little list there of where we've been. Interestingly, as a number of households, you've got 13.2% of boxes, and shelter kits is 24%. But if you look at the value, the actual value that costs, it bumps up to more like 50%, as we'll look in a minute. Now, 2015, the number of disasters. So, total there of, I do the maths, that's 17 disasters. Conflict and natural, it's about 50-50, 9 natural, 8 conflict. So, looking at the percentages there, if you look at the households in the conflict, we can do less households, and that kind of makes sense because in the conflict it's a lot harder to operate, it's a lot harder to reach people. That's why we're generally doing it remotely. In the natural disasters, the situation security-wise is a lot more permissive, and we can get to a lot more people. So that pans out to be, although it's about 50-50 in the number of disasters, we are still doing 3/4 of our households in natural disasters. And if you go down to the bottom there, again goes conflict and natural disasters in the boxes we've given out. And again, tents, we've done far more of our tents, in the natural disasters, and the UN, we've done far more UN tents in the conflict. Well, that makes sense, because I won't use a UN tent in a permissive environment unless I absolutely have to for other reasons. So that all pans out. Most of our shelter kit work is done in natural disasters, and tarps, all of it is done in the permissive environment. So that's how it breaks down that way. Moving on the backdrop of 2012 to 2015. So this is the last 4 years. Again, it breaks down conflict and natural disaster. It breaks down to be about 3/4 natural and 1/4 is conflict. And that bears out in those averages over the years, about the same in the households. The only reason that 2015 has been an anomaly that we've managed to reach more people in conflict is because of those pipelines we've got. It's unusual to get a conflict to be so stable as Syria, stable as in it's still there. It's obviously quite unstable inside the borders. But that's why we've got this blip of a year, why we've done more remote stuff than we normally would. I won't chat you through those quotas there, but you can see what we've done in wind and landslide, earthquake, drought, etc., over the years as a percentage. But it floods, again, it's going to be the top one because they are so big and they are so common. Now, breaking it down, 2015 on your little pie chart there. By households, we've done more shelter kits. With 40% of the households we reached with a shelter kit. And that's because they are 8 times cheaper than a box to get out. Now think of all those people that we couldn't have reached, or we could have reached but not with the appropriate aid. So this is not eating into the box, it's actually saving the box for those who want it. Box is still 22% by household, and then if you add that with the tents, you get up to 36 with the UN tents and the middies and everything else. So we're still, healthy numbers of boxes and tents. What I prefer is this pie chart, which is by value. So that's the amount of donors, what the donor's commitment is giving. 52% of boxes. So the donor, all these myths about, you don't use the box anymore. No, it's still, but in 2015, even when we've got something like Syria going on, where we're not going to put boxes out in Syria for the obvious reasons that I've bored you about before, but 52% by value is the box. Now you can get all sorts of people telling you all sorts of nonsense, but that is where the statistics are. And again, you've got it like 29% there, over a quarter, nearly, getting on for a third is UN. And that pretty much gives, the box is still the core of what we do. The UN had a big year because of Syria, because of the security element. Shelter kits by value, 11%. It's a significant thing because it's so versatile and it saves the box for those people who have absolutely nothing. And there's nothing to build anything out of in a shelter with those shelter kits, because there's got to be other stuff to go with it. You can't build a shelter out of what you just get in a shelter kit. There's got to be wood, there's got to be a natural element, and you've got to have that land ownership issue where you can actually start building stuff on that land. It's either got to be completely land that nobody wants, or you've got to have some sort of ownership or permission to be there. So shelter kits have its issues as well. So that's it really. Feel free to use those. If you can't get it as a download presentation, then please drop me an email at ALFE, that's alfie at shelterbox.org, and I can send you this PowerPoint. But that pretty much concludes 2015. It has been not dominated, but Syria has cast a long shadow, and that's borne out in those statistics that it's 2015 has been different to the previous 2 or 3 years. The donors out there have given us so much support, and there's been so many disasters that we've reached, so many people. Down to you, there's 28,000 families at least out there that have shelter when no one else is coming, and that is all down to you. 28,000. Thank you in advance for the support that hopefully you're going to give us in 2016 to keep doing this and keep pushing that ShelterBox agenda, is to reach people without shelter with aid that's appropriate, that is ethically given to them, it doesn't make their lives worse, and that is adapted to their needs and helps them on that journey back to a normal life. Thank you very much, and I'll be speaking to you soon.